Web dev is a bit of a mess right now. It feels like there's a new framework every week. There's new languages around web dev coming out. There's WASM, there's React, there's server components, Next, Svelte, Astro, new ways to write CSS, new ways to style things, new ways to do everything. It's always changing. It must be so hard to get started as a new dev right now. The barrier for entry is going up. In order to make a good website, you have to know so much. Or do you? Why are we thinking about it this way? Are all of these things true? We've gotten to a point as a community where we just assume things are harder and have gotten too complex. And it's often hard to have a conversation about that complexity because we all just assume it's too much. But is it? Have things actually gotten worse? Is starting as a new dev actually harder? And most importantly, is building great software easier or more difficult than it used to be? I would argue all of these things have improved. And I'm going to do my best to prove that here. Why is web continuing to get so chaotic? And is this for the better? Let's talk about it. So the first thing we need to talk about is everything. Not everything that we're going to talk about, but everything going on. What happened in the web dev ecosystem where so many new projects started to happen? Before, we got a new framework every 8 to 10 years. There was a long time in the web where things didn't change too much. We got new protocols, like we went from just HTML and then a little bit of interactive JavaScript to Ajax, allowing the browser to fetch additional data after the page is loaded and make changes, to the jQuery era, to components originally with Angular, then to React. We went from a new framework every 3 years to a new framework every 3 weeks. Things are changing so fast. And even the frameworks that we use every day, like React, went from a way to use classes to update elements to a way to build your whole application using functions and hooks to a server framework where you don't need APIs anymore. You just send HTML, kind of Rails style, kind of not. It's chaos. But this chaos is so good. Every one of those changes in the React ecosystem made the barrier for entry lower and made the applications you put out better. Yes, React is different from the way things used to work. And yes, if you knew how things used to work, you're going to see this new complexity and you're inherently going to challenge it because it's different from your understanding. But that difference doesn't make it bad. I want to diagram this. The argument I want to make is that in a given generation of technology, the change from one generation to another may feel more complex, but it almost never is. Let's take the complexity of how things worked before React. We're going to make a square. This square represents an Angular app back in the day. This Angular app is going to have a lot of pieces in it. It's going to have the big three are the model, the view, and the controller. If we reduce this to the smallest form, this is the complexity that your Angular app lives in, theoretically. This is just a silly diagram, but I'm trying to highlight a point. We look at a OG React app, these things got blended heavily. And the circle might be bigger, but this circle has all 3 parts in it. And this new bigger circle with all these parts is a component. And while if you compare this to any one of these pieces, like if we compare just the model to this crazy hybrid thing, this component is more complex than the model. And if this is how you choose to do your comparisons, because you're already familiar with this, you implicitly know the relationship between these other things. And now you're going to sit here and compare this little thing to this whole new model, because to you, this whole thing is new and the small thing is familiar. And the other pieces that you're ignoring are familiar, which is why you're ignoring them. The result of this is you might look at this and look here, this new model. And since your pieces don't map to it directly, the overlap might only be this big, or it could be like this. And it doesn't really matter which it is. You're going to say, hey, that component model is more complex than the model I had before, because you're not thinking in terms of the whole complexity and all of the complexity that exists in your Angular app. You're thinking in terms of the complexity of the one part you might understand about this new model, and you're comparing very different things. And we do this so much when we talk about new developers getting started. We love to say and assume that HTML, CSS, and JavaScript are the best point to get started. We say shit like that all the time. We love to. HTML, it's so simple, nothing changes. CSS is static, it's how the web's worked forever. Learn those first and then learn JavaScript. But what happens the first time someone wants to make a button? Suddenly that contract between HTML and CSS they might have spent a lot of time trying to figure out and understand is no longer the way their app works. As soon as they adopt React or Svelte or any of the other things, there might be some concepts and some overlap, but the complexity of HTML is not a complexity that can be directly mapped to these other things. And as much as we are already familiar with HTML, it's important to understand that our familiarity with HTML is not shared by somebody who's never wrote code before. And as strange as it might sound, learning something that has their expectations of the web baked in as the starting point is often the easier experience. And as crazy as this feels, starting with something like a Next.js project that they can open up in the browser and make changes to in Code Sandbox might be less complex to them because they're not bringing in past complexity. When we look at something like Next.js, and we've been coding for however long, we see that that there is so much going on there. There is a build tool, there is an editor plugin, there is backend and front end relationships, there's compiler steps that generate assets that do all sorts of different things. There's React and the React relationship with the style layer and Tailwind coming in and all of this other shit. But if you're new, you don't know what any of that is. And that's okay, because your goal as a newer developer is to build something for the first time. You're not here because the idea of HTML is cool to you. You're here because you want to build something. And the tools that help you build things that look and feel like the things you're used to using, those are going to be the best tools. And I am so tired of the argument that things getting more complex is bad, because you don't live in that complexity. You live in the framework you're building in and building the applications that we serve every day. And the amount of complexity we have to eat to build good applications is actually going down a lot. The magic of something like server components is here. And again, to go back to diagrams, let's take the mental model before server components. I'm going to put a line here because on one side of this line is your backend code, and on the other line end here is your front end code. You also probably have some complexity in the middle here, and that's your API layer. And this is the complexity of your application. If your job is just this section on the right here right now, and this is what you're used to your role being, is just living here, then you're not dealing with the whole application's complexity, which is why the new model might scare you. Because with server components, this changes a lot. Where the API is gone, so we gotta trim that size down a bit. We're already quite a bit smaller. And this barrier gets pushed back way further. Maybe you even get rid of it. And this section's front-end code isn't front-end code anymore, it's React code. So if you take this new model and you compare the size of this to the size of this, yeah, no shit, this is simpler. Be stupid to say otherwise. But people don't compare this to this. What people do is they move this here, and then they pretend that section on the left doesn't exist. And this is what they do. They're like, wow, server components are so much more complex. Why would you ever pick those over an SPA? Because I have site that goes further than where my boundary ends. You fucking dumbass. And I am so tired of this conversation. When people say the web is more complex, what they're often saying is, I have cut the line for where I can see here, and everything on the other side of this line is scarier than it used to be. You're changing where I put my walls, and I don't like changing where I put my walls. I like my walls. I like living in my little box and not changing my perspective or trying new things. Well, guess what? If you're a new developer building an application for the first time and you're trying these things out or learning, you need to know a decent bit about all these things. And if you're a new developer, this is going to be a lot more to learn than this, period. The new model and the progress we have made is a little chaotic for sure, but it is objectively less complex for most applications. Theoretically, there are more things you can do here and you could build something much more complex with it. And we've certainly seen that. We've seen React SPAs that are massive with millions of lines of code, but the amount of complexity it takes to solve a problem has gone down. And here's where my final tangent is. Were things better before? Obviously, my answer here is no, but I think when we talk about the way things were and how you could just write a PHP file or an HTML file and not worry about it, the result wasn't just simpler for developers. The result was simpler in the bad way for users. We can kind of break this down between Web 1 and Web 2, but I think it goes deeper than that. Before these new models existed, the amount of things your websites could do was small. Just like the types of things we could do on the web before. When the web was this simple, the actual complexity of what we did was simpler too. Orange is functionality, blue is complexity. So things you can do with static HTML aren't too complex. The complexity you have to eat is also pretty small. But if we look at React, you can do way more, and the complexity roughly matches. But depending on what you're doing, these could be very variable. And here's where I think things get really interesting, is what happens when you want to break out. When I want to go out to here, how much complexity do I have to eat to get here? When we lived in static HTML land, to get there, it was no simple feat, and many have done it, and they have felt a lot of pain getting there. You have to eat a ton of complexity. I would argue even more than where React lives. If you want to match the functionality, not even match, but just add additional functionality. Like I have static HTML and now I want to make an email client in it. Good luck reinventing the browser because that's what you're going to be doing. And this is why I like the React model, because this complexity is relatively fixed. And once you've learned it and adopted it, you can do most of what you would ever want to do with the web. There's very little you could do on the internet that React can't enable in some way. From building games to building thorough applications like Figma to building mobile applications to obviously building websites and blogs and all the same stuff. If the tools you use don't enable complexity beyond their feature set, you're going to eat way more complexity. When people compare this box to this box, I don't think they're being genuine about the feature box. This is why I think Astro is really interesting, because by default, Astro might look look a little weird because it has the same functionality as a static site, but it's more complex. But what happens if you need more functionality? Like we want to go out to here. You can adopt the complexity of another framework and pull it in on Astro. So this box is Astro's complexity, but maybe I have this one thing that needs to be interactive. I'm just doing like this. And I'll make a tiny mini React box in here just for that one part. Or maybe this is even more complex. Maybe I have the blog, and here I have the comments. And even though the complexity of Astro might be a decent bit bigger than the complexity of standard HTML, the amount of complexity I have to adopt to go outside of what Astro enables is way smaller. And this is what makes something like Astro so magic, is your ability to bring in better solutions when your problems have complexity that exists outside of the framework. React's choice here has always been it's just JavaScript, but that means when you have things like you want to interact with your canvas in React, good luck, have fun. That's how you end up here. There are tools that make it better, but these are three different ways of thinking. And I think when you compare technologies this way, making decisions becomes much easier. And while this might be more complex than this or even this, if you're building your first application, you don't know yet where in this spectrum your problem lives. You might think your thing's going to be static, but then suddenly you want to have a game in it, and now you're adopting crazy shit. Or you might be making a blog. I should color code these. Fine. Orange equals features or capabilities. Blue equals complexity. So with something like static HTML, when you break past your feature set, you have to add a ton of complexity to get any distance. And if the features you're building might exist out here, this is a really bad place to start. Astro is a better starting place in this regard, because as you find that complexity, as you learn and build and grow your applications and yourself, the cost to adopt additional features is inherently less complex than it is in something like static HTML. Like if I wanted shared styling with something like Tailwind, if I wanted an interactive component that had crazy animations in it, stuff like that, Astro makes it easy to adopt the right thing that is minimal complexity. React is kind of a sunk cost, but if your goal is to be able to make anything you see on the web, or if my goal as a teacher is to set up every person who watches the channel to be able to build whatever they have in their mind, the thing with the biggest expansion on the left here is probably the best bet. And as server components happen, the complexity might be going up slightly, but the functionality is going up immensely. And the result is wherever you cut your line, things are probably going to be better off overall. I think we talk about this stuff wrong, and that we look at these bars in isolation. Like we'll look at syntactic differences between Solid, Svelte, and React and point at those as though they are the end all be all of the framework conversation. But those syntax comparisons are exclusively living in this bar, but users don't. Users and developers live here. We are building things with these tools, and the complexity of what we're building should reflect the complexity of what we're using some amount, but the complexity of what we might learn and what we might want to do needs to be considered as well. So if you're new and you're not sure what you want to build just yet, it is impossible to beat React, because it doesn't matter if you stop here or if you stop here, the things you learn will still apply and you will still find success. But at the same time, if the thing you want to do happens to be here, like let's say you want to build an application with a button in it, starting with anything but React is going to send you down a lot of rabbit holes. Because here you'll learn HTML, and then you'll learn CSS, and then you'll learn jQuery, and you have to learn all these things. You have to know how they relate to each other, and then maybe, just maybe, you'll finally get that button working. But React rejects that notion entirely. And as such, I think things are better. And while there is still thrash every year, I think the goal of the thrash is to make it so most applications can have less complexity while also having more features. And that's where I think the web is going. So it was a bit more chaotic than usual, but I just had a lot of thoughts on the state of the web and how much the tools are moving. While we are getting new frameworks and solutions all of the time, we are also seeing the complexity of entry points going down more and more. And when you have a specific goal in mind, these new tools make it easier to get there while having to worry about fewer things. And yes, if we frame the way a front-end dev did a front-end site 5 years ago, compare it to a front-end dev right now, it might look like the front-end dev now works harder. But if we take the step back, we see that that front-end dev now is empowered to do things way past what they could before, both in terms of the features they can enable, as well as where the complexity they work in lives. Because those front-end devs are now writing serverless functions. They're now helping with backend. They're now building things that go far beyond HTML and CSS. And if you think front-end devs should just build blogs, cool, stop giving advice. Because I'm here to talk about the future of the web, not the past. And the future for the web is bright. So we should all be excited. And if you're not excited, you better give us some good reasons why, and not just shame people for being excited about the future. I couldn't be more hyped for where the web is going, and I'm going to keep talking about it because I'm building an audience of people who are excited excited too. And the people who are the most excited to push, build, and try new things, they will always be the ones who are the most successful. So I recommend reflecting on things so you can be on the right side of this chaos. Thank you as always. If you want to learn more about the new models that I'm talking about here, specifically about how the new server component stuff changes things, I'm going to pin a video about that there. Really like that one. Check it out if you haven't. Thank you guys as always. Peace, nerds.